The Echo of Silence. By David Hall. February 4, 2205. Chapter List. 1. The First Footstep. 2. Beneath the Blackened Skies. 3. The Hollow Chamber. 4. Voices in the Walls. 5. A Flock of Crows. 6. Shattered Echoes. 7. Beyond the Threshold. 8. The Last Breath. 9. The Devil's Masquerade. 10. Dying in the Dark. Summary: in a near-future world devastated by warfare, a squad of elite soldiers is dispatched on a covert mission to investigate a series of strange occurrences in an abandoned military outpost. What begins as a standard reconnaissance operation spirals into a nightmare as the soldiers discover a hidden, grotesque secret beneath the crumbling walls of the compound. Trapped in a decaying world that defies the laws of reality, they begin to question their own sanity, plagued by disturbing visions and hallucinations. As their numbers dwindle, the soldiers must confront both their inner demons and the dark forces haunting the compound. The line between the living and the dead blurs, and the terror of what lurks in the shadows threatens to consume them all. Chapter 1: The First Footstep. The cold bite of wind cut through the exposed fields as the squad trudged forward, the heavy weight of their boots sinking into the snow with each deliberate step. Their mission was simple: investigate the abandoned military outpost, verify its status, and report back. But as the fortress-like structure loomed in the distance, a thick veil of unease settled over them. A ghostly silence enveloped the area, no wildlife, no distant hum of machinery, only the dead stillness of an abandoned world. Lieutenant Caleb Price scanned the horizon, his breath coming out in visible clouds. His team of 6 was a mix of veterans, hardened by years of combat, yet none of them could shake the feeling that something was wrong here. Something more than just the eerie emptiness that surrounded them. "All clear so far, sir," Private Dalton muttered, peering through his rifle's scope. "Nothing moving. No signs of life." "Keep your eyes peeled," Price replied, his voice a low growl, cutting through the tension. "We don't know what we're walking into." The building ahead was once a military base, its walls now weathered and crumbling under the strain of years of neglect. A thick layer of ice clung to the walls like a death shroud. Yet, something about the structure felt wrong. The windows, shattered long ago, were sealed with a strange black resin, and the air around it seemed heavy, thick with some unspoken menace. "Move out," Price commanded. "We've got a job to do." As they approached the compound, the temperature seemed to drop even further, the air growing denser with each step. The sounds of their boots crunching against the snow became muffled, as if the very ground itself was trying to swallow the noise. The first door they came across was sealed tight, a rusted metal barrier that resisted their attempts to open it. Price motioned to Corporal Harper, who produced a small explosive charge. "On my mark," Price ordered. Harper nodded, setting the charge against the door. The deafening sound of the explosion reverberated through the air, the metal door flying off its hinges. As the smoke cleared, they stepped inside, weapons raised, ready for anything. But what they saw was not what they had expected. The interior was dark, but not just because of the lack of light. It was as if the darkness itself had weight, pressing against their senses. The walls were covered in strange marking symbols and runes they couldn't begin to comprehend. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of decay and something darker, something ancient. "Keep moving," Price growled, his voice firm but strained. He motioned for the squad to fan out. As they moved deeper into the compound, the silence became almost oppressive, the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. Every footstep felt like an intrusion, a violation of the stillness that surrounded them. Private Stone, one of the newer recruits, paused for a moment, his hand resting on the wall as if to steady himself. "I don't like this," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Stay focused," Price snapped, but even his tone lacked the usual confidence. There was something wrong here, something he couldn't put into words. They came across a hallway that stretched into the dark, the walls lined with doors, all closed, all waiting. Price's eyes narrowed as he signaled for the team to move forward. That's when they heard it. A soft sound, like a distant whisper, barely perceptible over the hum of their own breathing. But it was there. Just beyond the edge of hearing. "Did you hear that?" Dalton asked, his voice tight. Price held up a hand, signaling for silence. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't words, just a strange, guttural sound that seemed to come from every direction at once. "Let's keep moving," Price ordered, his pulse quickening. But the deeper they went, the more the whispering grew. The walls seemed to close in on them, and the temperature plummeted. It wasn't just cold anymore, it was unnatural. The air seemed to vibrate with something ancient, something otherworldly. As they approached the heart of the compound, the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. Then, without warning, the ground beneath them trembled, and the lights flickered on and off. The air thickened, and for a moment, Price felt a cold hand of dread clutch at his heart. And then, as quickly as it started, everything fell silent again. "Stay alert," Price ordered, trying to steady his breath. "We're not alone here." The squad moved forward, the shadows stretching unnaturally before them, the silence pressing in from all sides. They reached a large chamber at the center of the compound, a room that seemed out of place, like something had been carved into the very earth beneath them. It was circular, with a high ceiling, and in the center was a large stone altar, stained dark with what appeared to be old blood. On the walls, the symbols from earlier were now glowing faintly, pulsating with an eerie light. The whispering returned, louder than ever, and the soldiers felt the unmistakable sensation of eyes watching them from the darkness. "Get back," Price ordered, his instincts screaming at him. But it was too late. Suddenly, the walls cracked open, revealing grotesque, twisted figures, their eyes glowing with a sickly light. They stepped forward, their limbs moving in unnatural ways. The soldiers opened fire, but the bullets seemed to pass right through them, the creatures unharmed. And in the distance, a voice, soft but growing louder, echoed in their minds. "Welcome to the end." Chapter 2, Beneath the Blackened Skies. The soldiers' weapons fired in a desperate frenzy, their rounds ricocheting harmlessly off the ghostly forms that emerged from the walls. The creatures seemed to glide through the air, their bodies impossibly thin and twisted. Their eyes, an unnatural glow of pale green, fixated on the soldiers, as though savoring their terror. The air grew thick with the stench of decay and something far worse, something ancient. "Move!" Price screamed, his voice strained as he backed away from the altar. He gestured wildly for the squad to retreat, but his legs felt like lead. The oppressive air around them seemed to slow their movements, the very ground pulling them down. "Cover the exit!" Dalton shouted, firing his rifle at the nearest creature. The bullets passed through its transparent form with no effect, but the creature hissed in response, a sound like the scraping of nails across stone. The thing reached out with elongated, clawed hands, the tips of its fingers trailing something like dark smoke in the air. "Damn it, they're not real!" Harper yelled, his voice cracking with disbelief as he fired his sidearm at one of the figures. It phased through the bullet, undeterred. "Get to the door!" Price barked again, his tone now tinged with panic. "We need to regroup and find another way out." The squad scrambled toward the entrance, but the walls seemed to shift and move, closing them in. The door, once open, slammed shut with a resounding thud, trapping them inside. The squad turned in unison, their faces pale with fear. The creatures had surrounded them, their bodies warping in and out of existence, their forms ever changing, as if reality itself was bending around them. Price's mind raced. His training had prepared him for everything except this. He had seen hell before. He had seen the ravages of war, the shattered bodies, the screams of men torn apart by violence. But this was something else. This was not of this world. Stay close, Price ordered, positioning himself between his men and the grotesque entities. Whatever happens, do not let them touch you. Harper fired again, and this time, one of the figures stumbled, its ethereal form flickering. It screeched, a sound that pierced their minds, sending waves of dizziness and nausea through the soldiers. Price's head spun as the wall seemed to collapse inward, the ground beneath them rippling like water. He stumbled, losing his balance, and found himself on his knees, gasping for air. Dalton, his face a mask of terror, screamed as one of the creatures lunged toward him, its claws slashing the air. "It's in my head," he cried, clutching his helmet, his eyes wide with fear. "I can't think straight. It's talking to me. Don't listen to it." Price shouted, forcing himself to stand. He grabbed Dalton by the shoulder and shook him, pulling him away from the oncoming creature. "Focus, goddammit. Stay with me." But Dalton's eyes were unfocused, his mind lost in the haze of fear and confusion. He staggered, his legs giving out from under him, and Price barely managed to catch him before he fell. The soldier's breathing was erratic, his lips moving as though he were speaking to someone something that only he could see. "They're all around us," Dalton whispered, his voice trembling. "I can hear them. I can feel them." The creature lunged, but Price shoved Dalton aside just in time, and the soldier was dragged away by the horrific being. Price's heart lurched in his chest as he saw Dalton's eyes go wide, the last traces of humanity vanishing from his face. The creature's claws sunk into his flesh, the wound bleeding black, before Dalton's screams were silenced. "No!" Price yelled, but the words were lost in the chaos. Harper opened fire again, but it was futile. The shots only made the creatures writhe in delight, as if they were playing with their prey, savoring each second of terror. The ground shook once more, this time with a violent force that sent them all tumbling. Price's body hit the cold, hard floor, and his head cracked against the stone, momentarily blurring his vision. Through the haze, he saw the figures grow larger, more tangible. They were no longer illusions, they were real. A guttural growl sounded from the far corner of the room, and Price's heart skipped a beat as a massive shape materialized from the shadows. It was a hulking figure, far more solid than the others, its form so monstrous that it seemed to distort reality itself. The thing's eyes burned with an intensity that threatened to consume everything in its path. The creature opened its mouth, a mouth filled with rows of jagged, razor-sharp teeth, and let out a deafening roar. The air vibrated with the sound, rattling Price's bones and nearly deafening him. His mind felt as though it was being torn apart. His breath came in shallow gasps as the overwhelming terror gripped him like a vice. "We're dead," Harper muttered, his voice barely audible. He had fallen to his knees, clutching his rifle like a lifeline. "We're all dead." Price's chest heaved with desperation. He had to think, had to do something, but his mind felt slow, sluggish, as if the very air was clouding his thoughts. The creatures were closing in, their forms flickering in and out of focus. The massive creature's eyes locked onto Price, and for a moment, it seemed as if time had stopped. The world around him blurred, and he saw only those glowing eyes, dark and endless, staring into his soul. "It knows me. It knows us all." The voice came not through his ears, but through his mind. The words echoed in his thoughts, cold and suffocating, as if they were already a part of him. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but his body betrayed him. His arms felt heavy, his vision narrowing. He was drowning in the pressure, in the weight of whatever this place had become. And then, just as the creature lunged toward him, a new sound pierced the air, the screech of metal tearing through the walls, the boom of an explosion. Price barely had time to register the shift before the ground shook violently again. The walls cracked wide open, and something massive erupted from beneath the compound, sending debris and dust into the air. The soldiers were thrown back, their world collapsing around them. The massive creature, too, was caught in the blast, its body disintegrating into black smoke that evaporated into the air. Price's vision faded in and out, the world around him a blur of darkness. The last thing he heard before slipping into unconsciousness was the voice familiar, terrifying whispering in his mind once more. "We will not stop until all is consumed." Chapter 3, The Echoes of Despair. The world felt distant, like a dream from which Price couldn't wake. His body felt heavy, as if shackled to the floor by invisible chains. His mind swam in and out of clarity, the darkness pulling at him like a tidal wave. The last thing he remembered was the explosion, the deafening roar of the collapsing walls, and then nothing. When he finally opened his eyes, the world was still. The familiar hum of the compound, the hiss of air filtration, the distant chatter of radio transmissions, all of it was gone. Instead, there was only a suffocating silence, thick as smoke, cloying at his throat. Price slowly sat up, his head pounding. His helmet was gone, his vision blurry, and his limbs felt stiff as though they'd been abandoned by his own body. His fingers brushed against the cold concrete beneath him, the surface slick with something he couldn't immediately identify. Blood. His own or someone else's, he couldn't tell. The room was dark, dimly lit by the faint glow of an emergency light far overhead. His squad, where were they? He blinked rapidly, trying to clear his mind. A few feet away, Harper's motionless body lay sprawled out on the floor, his face twisted in a grotesque mask of terror. Price swallowed hard, fighting the bile rising in his throat. His eyes darted across the room, desperately searching for anyone still alive. The air tasted of ash and death. "Dalton!" Price croaked, his voice hoarse, barely more than a whisper. There was no response. He pushed himself to his feet, his head swimming as the dark, claustrophobic space around him began to close in. The walls, once solid and unyielding, now felt like they were pressing inward. The ceiling was too low. The air too thick. He needed to leave, but the exit was nowhere in sight. The entire facility seemed to have shifted, or perhaps it was his mind that had fractured under the strain. He staggered toward the far side of the room, where a steel door had been blown off its hinges, revealing a corridor beyond. He knew that he should have stayed, waited for reinforcements, but the instinct to survive clawed at him. The door led out, didn't it? A screech echoed from somewhere in the distance. It wasn't human, wasn't anything he recognized. The sound scraped across his mind like the twisting of metal, a shrill, high-pitched wail that reverberated deep within his bones. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Something was coming. Something worse. He had no choice. Price pushed himself toward the door, every step like dragging his feet through mud. The corridor beyond was dark, lit only by the faint glow of emergency lights above. The walls were streaked with dark, wet smears, as if something had bled or worse across the surfaces. His boots echoed in the silence, a sharp, hollow sound that seemed to amplify in the emptiness. The flickering lights above cast unsettling shadows that danced on the walls, twisting and stretching as if they were alive. He could almost hear them whispering, but when he strained his ears, the sounds dissolved into the wind. It was maddening. The very air around him seemed to pulse, as if it were alive with something waiting. Price continued down the hallway, the feeling of eyes on him growing with every step. The shadows crept closer, folding in on themselves. The feeling of dread was unbearable. The walls seemed to breathe. At the end of the corridor, another door lay partially open. The faint smell of something rancid wafted toward him. He hesitated, his heart hammering in his chest. Something was wrong, horribly wrong. He could feel it deep in his gut. With a trembling hand, he pushed the door open and entered. Inside, the room was a twisted reflection of what it should have been. The walls were covered in strange, alien symbols, each one glowing faintly, as though they were alive. The floor was cracked, as if something immense had moved through it. The room was a mess, scattered equipment, broken furniture, and the smell of burnt ozone filled the air. But what struck him most was the altar in the center of the room. It was ancient, its stone surface marred with deep cracks, covered in an unfamiliar substance that shimmered sickly under the dim light. And there, standing at the altar, was the form of a man. No. Not a man. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, draped in a tattered cloak. Its face was obscured by shadows, but Price could feel its eyes, cold, all-seeing, and ancient. The air seemed to bend around it, warping reality itself. The being was no longer just a presence, it was a force. Price's pulse quickened. The voice he had heard before, "We will not stop until all is consumed," echoed in his mind again, and he realized, with chilling certainty, that the figure before him was no mere soldier, no human at all. It was something older. Something from beyond the stars. "Price." The voice whispered, but the figure's lips did not move. The voice seemed to come from every direction, as if it were not speaking to him, but through him. Price's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the presence invading his mind, wrapping around his thoughts, seeping into his very soul. It was suffocating. His limbs trembled, his skin crawling with the sensation of being watched, of being judged. The figure slowly raised its hand, and the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening. A flood of memories hit him all at once: his training, his squad, the mission. His mind fragmented, and the line between reality and madness blurred. The figure's power was overwhelming, drowning him in an ocean of despair. "You were never meant to survive," the figure said, its voice now clear, distorted by 1,000 echoes. "You were only ever meant to be a sacrifice." Price stumbled backward, his head spinning, his body paralyzed by the weight of the truth. He couldn't fight it. He couldn't escape it. The figure's eyes burned with malevolent intent. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, everything went dark. Chapter 4, The Hollow Ones. Price awoke with a start, gasping for air as if he'd been submerged underwater for too long. His chest heaved, but the cold air burned as it filled his lungs. He was still in the room, at least, he thought he was. The altar stood in the center, though its surface seemed to writhe, the alien symbols flickering erratically. The space around him was both alien and familiar, disorienting him to the point of nausea. His mind scrambled for answers, each thought slippery and half-formed. Was it real? Was he dead? The encounter, no, the thing was so unnatural, so far removed from anything he had known, that Price felt like he was slowly unraveling at the edges. He shakily pushed himself up from the floor, his hands trembling. The echoes of that voice still resounded in his skull, relentless and suffocating. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being hunted, that the very air around him was closing in. With a sharp intake of breath, he wiped his face with the back of his hand and blinked, trying to steady his mind. The room remained eerily still, the only sound his own ragged breathing. Yet, there was an unshakable sense of presence in the room, like an unseen eye that never blinked. "You should leave," a voice murmured softly from behind him. Price froze, his blood running cold. The voice was not the one from before, this one was human. He spun around, his instincts screaming at him to be ready for anything. But the room remained empty, save for the altar and its glowing symbols. Another voice, faint but unmistakable, echoed in his mind, "We are coming." Suddenly, the door behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang, locking him in the chamber. Panic surged within him as the walls seemed to close in further. The lights above flickered again, casting long, grotesque shadows that twisted unnaturally on the walls. He could hear the faint scrape of something moving, dragging itself across the floor. Price turned back toward the altar, his heart pounding, knowing something was emerging from it, something he couldn't fully comprehend. The shadows seemed to grow darker, thicker, and then they began to move. They coiled and slithered like living things, converging on the altar in a sickening mass. Slowly, a figure began to emerge from the darkness. It was human or something close to it. A man, perhaps. His features were pale and devoid of expression, eyes black as pitch. His limbs were long and emaciated, skin stretched thin over a frame too tall to be natural. The Hollow One. Price took an instinctive step back. His mind was screaming for him to run, but his legs refused to cooperate, frozen in place by some primal terror he couldn't name. The Hollow One's head tilted, as though inspecting him. Its eyes glinted with malicious amusement, as if it were enjoying his fear. And then, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped, the voice a discordant mix of human and something far older. Price tried to respond, but his voice caught in his throat, the words too tangled in his fear. His eyes darted toward the door, but he knew that it wouldn't open, that there was no escape. The Hollow One's lips parted, revealing a mouthful of jagged, needle-like teeth. Its smile stretched unnaturally wide, as though it couldn't stop, its face contorting with sadistic pleasure. "The world is already dying," it continued, its voice a raspy whisper that echoed in Price's head. "We are simply here to help it along." Price's stomach twisted. What the hell did it mean? What was it? What was going on? It took a slow step forward, and Price could feel the air grow colder, the temperature plummeting rapidly. He could almost hear the thing's thoughts pressing against his mind, intruding upon his own. It was as though the creature was devouring his very will, slowly erasing his thoughts, turning him into nothing more than a helpless animal before it. "Don't resist," the Hollow One crooned, its voice a cruel lullaby. "You will see soon enough. We all will." The walls seemed to pulse with life, the alien symbols glowing brighter, and then the ground trembled. A sound of movement, massive and insistent, filled the room. Something was coming from deep beneath the facility, something far worse than the Hollow One. The entire room seemed to vibrate, and the walls began to crack, jagged fissures spreading like webs of chaos. "Help!" Price managed to choke out, his voice shaking. "What do you want with us?" The Hollow One laughed, the sound high-pitched and grating, as though it was mocking him. It reached out with one spindly hand and caressed Price's cheek, its touch cold and slimy, like the surface of a dead animal. "You'll understand soon," it whispered. "Soon, there will be no hiding from what's coming." Price recoiled, panic surging through him, but his legs still refused to obey. The creature's grip tightened, and with one cruel yank, it dragged him forward, forcing him closer to the altar. He could feel his pulse quickening, his heart hammering in his chest. The air grew denser, oppressive, the atmosphere heavy with the weight of inevitability. "No, no." Price gasped, struggling against the creature's iron grip. "Let me go." The Hollow One's eyes gleamed in dark amusement as it brought him within inches of the altar. And then, the ground split. From the crack in the floor, a grotesque figure emerged, something beyond human understanding. A twisted amalgamation of flesh and metal, its form shifting like liquid, like a being caught between planes of reality. It was massive, its body covered in pulsating, sinewy tendrils, its eyes glowing with an unnatural, eldritch fire. It let out a deafening screech, the sound ripping through Price's skull like jagged shards of glass. He dropped to his knees, overwhelmed by the terror that washed over him. His vision blurred, the world spinning wildly out of control. The Hollow One's grip released, and Price collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, unable to move. The creature above him was too much to comprehend. There was no rhyme or reason to its form, no logic to its existence. It was the embodiment of everything wrong in the universe. It was pure chaos. And it was coming for him. Chapter 5, The Abyss Beckons. Price's vision blurred as the grotesque creature loomed over him. His mind struggled to make sense of what he was seeing, if it was even possible to comprehend something so utterly alien. The thing that had emerged from the split in the floor was wrong in every conceivable way. Its body, writhing and shifting like molten flesh, seemed to ripple with every movement, as though it could never settle into a single form. Its eyes, those burning, malevolent orbs, seemed to see right through him, piercing his very soul. Every part of his body screamed to move, to escape, but his limbs were frozen, locked in place by a primal terror deeper than anything he had ever known. It was coming. He could feel it. The Hollow One, now standing beside the altar, spoke again, its voice now distorted, as though echoing from deep beneath the earth. "You will join the others soon, human. We are the architects of this world's unraveling, and your mind is ours to bend." Price wanted to scream. Wanted to fight. But there was nothing left in him. He was a child trapped in a nightmare far beyond his ability to understand, his body too weak to defy the horrors that had been unleashed. With a slow, deliberate movement, the grotesque being reached down toward him. Its massive hand, covered in writhing tendrils, extended like a shadow, a horrifying silhouette against the flickering light of the altar. Price instinctively shrank back, but the ground beneath him cracked and shifted, the very earth seeming to pulse with malevolent energy. The creature's fingers brushed his cheek, cold, wet, and slick with something he could not identify. It smelled of decay, of death, of things long forgotten. A sharp, guttural laugh escaped the creature's mouth, a noise so loud that Price thought his ears would split open from the sound alone. "You fear it, don't you? The truth of what we are. The truth of what awaits you." The Hollow One nodded, its features twisting into something like satisfaction. "The abyss is patient, human. It has waited for so long. And now, it calls." Price could feel his heart racing in his chest, the thundering beat drowning out all other sounds. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and dread, his thoughts fragmented like shards of glass. What were these creatures? What had they unleashed in this forsaken place? Then, with a sudden and sickening twist, the creature's hand closed around his wrist. Price screamed, the pain ripping through him as the thing's grip tightened with inhuman strength. He could feel his bones creaking, his skin protesting against the pressure, but there was no escape. The world around him spun, each turn dragging him deeper into the nightmarish depths. A voice broke through the madness, faint but clear. It was not the Hollow One's voice, but something more human. Someone, or something else. "You must fight." Price's eyes snapped open. His breath hitched. He could hear the voice clearly now, a warning. But it was too late. The creature before him, its eyes locked on his, smiled again, that twisted, jagged grin spreading wider, the sight filling Price with an indescribable sense of revulsion. "Fight," the Hollow One mocked. "There is no fighting what is already within you." The creature began to pull him toward the altar, and the world around them seemed to distort. The symbols on the altar pulsed erratically, casting grotesque, shifting shadows against the walls, each one stretching and warping like a living thing. Price struggled, but his body no longer obeyed. His arms, his legs, everything was locked in place, and the fear clawing at his mind was a constant, gnawing presence. He felt as if he were sinking into something worse, something far beyond mere death. Suddenly, the ground trembled again, a deep, violent shudder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The altar cracked open with a deafening sound, revealing an abyss beneath it, a dark void so deep, it seemed to have no end. The blackness seemed to suck the light from the room, devouring everything in its path. "No!" Price gasped, his voice breaking. "What is that?" The creature leaned in close, its voice a low, cruel whisper. "This is the void. The end of all things. Your mind, your soul, all of you, you will be lost to it." Price's heart raced, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he could feel the pull of the void, a cold, empty sensation that seemed to drag at his very being. He fought against it, clawing at the air, struggling to breathe, to think. But it was no use. The abyss was drawing him in, and his vision began to blur again, the darkness of the void consuming him. He could feel his thoughts slipping, his consciousness fading as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling before him. Then, just as the abyss was about to swallow him whole, the voice returned louder this time, more insistent. Fight. A surge of adrenaline coursed through Price's veins. He felt the cold grip of the creature falter for just a moment, as if something had interfered. For the first time since he had stepped foot in this hellhole, he felt a flicker of hope, a desperate, dying ember that refused to be snuffed out. Price twisted in the creature's grip, his body screaming in protest as he fought to break free. He reached for the one thing that might save him, the knife that had been lodged in his belt. His fingers found it, trembling with fear and desperation, and with a violent slash, he plunged it into the creature's hand. It screeched in agony, releasing its grip for a moment. Price didn't hesitate. He pulled himself free, stumbling backward, gasping for air. The creature recoiled, its pale eyes burning with fury. It snarled, its form shifting again, becoming something even more grotesque, a nightmarish fusion of flesh and shadow. You think you can escape, it hissed. You are already lost. Price didn't look back. He bolted for the exit, his breath ragged and his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of the creature's screeching followed him, but he didn't dare stop. He didn't dare look back. The doors to the chamber burst open as he neared them, the cold wind outside hitting him like a slap to the face. Price stumbled into the hallway, disoriented but driven by pure survival instinct. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't care. He just needed to get away from the altar, away from the hollow ones, away from the abyss. But in his gut, he knew. It wasn't over. He had escaped, yes, but they were still out there. Watching. Waiting. And they weren't done with him. Chapter 6, The Unseen Watchers. Price's lungs burned as he staggered through the hallway, every step an agony of bruised muscles and fear-soaked desperation. The air around him was thick with the scent of decay, a smell that seemed to saturate the very walls. His mind screamed for answers. He needed to understand what was happening, why it was happening, but his thoughts refused to form into anything coherent. Every rational part of him had long been drowned by the horrors he'd witnessed. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he stumbled into a dimly lit corridor. The walls seemed to pulse, and the lights above flickered erratically, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor like crawling tendrils. Price's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. He needed to find a way out, anything to get away from whatever nightmare had ensnared him. Behind him, he could hear it, the faint, echoing sound of something dragging across the floor, a rhythmic scraping that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. His stomach twisted with dread, but he refused to look back. He could feel it, a presence, close enough that he could almost hear its breath, even though he was alone. The hollow ones, he thought. They were still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for him to slip up. He couldn't stop, couldn't let himself falter, not for a second. The world itself had become his enemy. His legs threatened to buckle beneath him, but he forced himself onward. His hands, slick with sweat, gripped the knife he still clutched tightly, as though it were the only thing keeping him tethered to his sanity. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of what he had just witnessed pressing down on him like an insurmountable burden. As he turned a corner, he caught sight of a door ahead, one that appeared to lead to the outside. Maybe. Just maybe, if he could reach that door, he could escape this nightmare. His pulse quickened as he neared it, his body trembling from the strain. The sound of scraping grew louder, closer, like the footsteps of something that was too large to hide. He didn't dare look back. He could feel the weight of its gaze on him, even if he couldn't see the thing that hunted him. He reached the door and tried the handle. Locked. Panic surged through him, and he slammed his shoulder against the door, desperate to break it open. His entire body screamed in protest, but the door finally gave way with a loud crash, the wood splintering under the force. He stumbled outside into the cold night air, gasping for breath, his vision swimming from the effort. But as he looked around, he froze. The forest, this vast, oppressive wilderness, was not what he remembered. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like clawed fingers, casting long, dark shadows that seemed to breathe. The ground beneath him was slick with something that gleamed unnaturally in the dim moonlight, a slick sheen that felt wrong, as if the earth itself had become a part of the nightmare. Price shook his head, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. He had been in the forest moments ago, hadn't he? But this was no forest he recognized. This was something far worse, something that should not exist. And then, from the shadows, they emerged. Figures cloaked in darkness, their faces hidden by hoods, glided through the trees like phantoms. Price's heart lurched in his chest. There were no sounds, no footsteps, no rustling leaves, just an unnatural silence that pressed down on him. They moved in unison, as if they were part of the very shadows themselves. He backed away, his breath shallow and ragged, the knife still gripped tightly in his hand. They were getting closer. And then, one of them stepped forward, tall, imposing, and unblinking. Its presence alone seemed to crush the air around him. It spoke, and its voice was like the groan of ancient stone being split in half. "You cannot escape. There is nowhere to run." The words, though simple, carried a weight that suffocated him. Price's legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to his knees, the knife falling from his grasp. The figure stepped closer, its form shifting and distorting as it approached. No. Price thought, his mind a whirlwind of panic. Not again. Please, not again. The figure reached down, its hand cold and unyielding as it touched his forehead. A wave of icy dread washed over him, and his vision swam with flashes of horrible, fleeting images. People know, things flesh rotting and twisting, eyes burning with malevolent light, their bodies mangled and torn. He could feel their pain, their desperation, and it threatened to drown him. "You will understand soon enough," the figure murmured, its voice echoing inside his skull. "The truth is not something you can escape." Price gasped, his body trembling uncontrollably as the figure's touch began to burn through his skin. The ground beneath him seemed to dissolve into nothingness, and he felt himself falling, spiraling downward into a dark abyss. There was no end to it, no floor beneath him to catch his fall, just an endless, swirling void of dread and terror. And in that void, he could feel the pull, the call of something ancient, something far beyond the comprehension of any human mind. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped him. His throat constricted, as though something was tightening around it, squeezing the life out of him. Through the darkness, a face appeared, a face he recognized, though it should have been impossible. It was his own. But twisted, distorted, cracked open like a porcelain doll. The eyes, black and empty, stared at him with an unblinking gaze that sent chills through his very soul. He reached out, as though trying to stop the vision, but the moment his fingers brushed the face, it shattered, crumbled into dust that blew away in the wind. And then, in that fleeting moment of clarity, he understood. He wasn't just running from the nightmare, he was inside it. His mind, his very soul, was already lost to the abyss. The creature's voice filled the void, louder now, mocking him with cruel certainty. "You were always ours, Price. You have always belonged here." Price's scream was swallowed by the dark. The end.